First of all, thank you very much for all of you to come all the way to San Galo in almost siesta time. So thank you very much. Well, just we have on the screen the Free Turkey Journalist. This is a campaign that the IPI, the International Press Institute, it's together with other partners and journalists, in Turkey. We are developing right now because, I'm sure you probably know what's the situation in Turkey, but there are around 150 journalists imprisoned right now, and at the end of the panel, just for the last 3 minutes, we're going to do a small, holding the pancards and a demonstration. Just basically, if you want to participate, to show support for all the journalists imprisoned in Turkey. But the main topic of this panel is online harassment against journalists, and specifically the online harassment against journalists as a tool that states and powerful actors, state actors, such as political parties, are starting to use to discredit and to silence critical voices and dissent in the country. Basically, the idea is that IPI started to work on that, on online harassment back in 2014. One of our first ideas was to try to understand what the online harassment was specifically. And rather than coming up with a definition, what we decided is to work on the attacks itself, to try to understand the threats, the aggressions, and the patterns that they may take at that point. Basically, what we did, it's for probably like a few months, we did a couple of missions to Turkey, but also in Austria and Hungary. And what we tried to decide is what was the impact on journalists, the psychological impact, the professional toll as well that these sort of attacks had on the issue, on the journalists, on their work. Basically, the main idea is, after all that, and learning from basically the one-on-one interviews, we saw that there is basically sort of a standard sort of attacks. With all that, what we did is we came with a methodology, basically a list of categories with which we tried to, shed some light into the phenomena. For a year, from 2016, January 2016, all the way to January 2017, we collected threats, what we say instances of attacks, that's what we call it, and we analyze them according to around 20 different variables. We poured all the data, into an interactive database that you can see right here. It's online dv.ipi.media, and the three categories that we came up with, broad categories, was threats of violence, abusive behavior, and technical interferences. Eventually, in total, we've collected around a sample of 1,065 instances of online threats and verbal abuse. The collection of data was in 2 different countries, was Austria and Turkey. I'm going to show you Turkey. Basically, what you can see here is that, out of the threats of violence, most of them, or like a huge percentage, 118 instances, actually 67% of all the sample that we collected are implied threats, or threats that you have to read in between lines. Most of the attacks were basically 760 were related to abusive behavior, and 14 attacks that we actually monitored and collected was technical interference. This is just a snapshot of the amount of attacks and instances of threats, and but of course we didn't pretend to collect everything because it was humanly impossible for us to do at that point. So basically, if you have time, just you can go and explore basically different sort of data. You can cross data by abusive behavior, by gender, by background, etc. So what we achieved with that was to understand a little bit what was the attacks itself, the instances. But what we, during that process, what we discovered is that there are certain patterns as well. Basically, 51% of the attacks have to do of violent threats, and death threats had to do with nationalism in Turkey. 31% had to do around politics and criticizing what AKP and the government was the policies that they were implementing, and 12% related to terrorism or accusing the journalists of being spies, terrorists themselves. But basically, what we discovered as well is that besides this online harassment and threats on social media platforms, basically we studied in Turkey Twitter and in Austria Facebook. What we discovered is that there were also different parallel attacks happening at the same time or around the same time. This can be, or we had like cases where the attacks against a specific journalist were informed of DDoS attacks, basically trying to take down their blogs, trying to take down the websites where they were working from. Also news websites, or let's say masquerade as news websites supported by very dubious foundations, wrote smear articles against the journalists. Also at the same time, they were receiving phishing emails with very specific and tailored links where they can actually click, usually faking trusted sources. Also at the same time, there was this hacking attempts on social media accounts, people or hackers trying to gain access to Twitter. It's also important to understand, or at least in the area of Turkey, is that the social media platform that steers the political debate in Turkey, it's basically Twitter that has a lot of impact in terms of the political debate. So a closer look into all these parallel attacks, what we discovered is that the sources were pretty similar, or they shared some of the sources, or they were retweeting, or then the core idea that all these different paths shared were exactly the same, and they were also sort of sharing the same objective, trying to discredit, trying to silence, to intimidate the journalists. So what we thought is that, well, that's pretty much all these 5 elements. It's what we thought that conformed an online campaign. Here we're not talking about, like real physical attacks or legal prosecution. We're talking specifically about online campaigns. And what we saw as well at the same time is that in order to do all that, that requires a lot of resources, both economic resources and human resources. So by putting all these elements together, what we saw is that only states and powerful state actors, such political parties, were able to develop and implement something like that. So to talk precisely about all these from 3 very unique perspectives, we have 3 experts on the matter. Here with me, we have Irina Borogan, who is a Russian investigative journalist, deputy editor and co-founder of Agentura.ru, and the co-author, together with Andrei Solotov, of the book, The Red Web, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. And basically is the struggle between Russia's digital dictators and the new online revolutionaries. Also Ingrid Bratnik, a writer journalist from Austria, and the author of Hass im Netz, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but it's hate on the net, online violence, basically. She's also an expert on the matter and will actually bring to the discussion what's happening with the far-right movement in German-speaking countries and the digital ecosystem. And finally, with us, the digital media manager of Hurriyet, which is one of the biggest newspapers in Turkey, and also an expert on the matter since he's been writing about trolls in Turkey and online harassment since 2012, even before the Gezi Park protest started. So thank you very much for all of you to come here. And let's just jump in. Irina, we might start with you. Basically, the idea is, first of all, what we like to know is a little bit of the context. How in Russia, that seems to be one of the precursors of this online harassment and the troll factories, how all the situation evolved since 2006, 2007, 2002, where you have been actually working on it.
Thank you for having me here in this beautiful place. And few things about Russian trolls. They appeared much earlier than most of the public went to the social networks. In the early 2000s, trolls appeared on the on the forums of online media for the first. And I have a personal experience of that because in October 2002, me and my colleague and co-founder of our website, agentura.ru, Andrei Soldatov, covered a hostage-taking crisis in Moscow. 1,000 people were taken hostage in a theater for 3 months and by the terrorists. But during the hostage rescue operation, no one of the hostages was killed by terrorists. But at least 131 people were killed by poison gas that was pumped up into the theater by the security services in order to put terrorists in sleep. And that was, for us as journalists, that was a terrible situation, especially that nobody was punished for this. And there was no proper investigation. And people who were responsible for gas attack, I can say that, wasn't identified and was not punished. And we covered these issues harshly and criticized authorities for that and tried to find these people and expose them But because of this, the FSB, the main security service in Russia, opened a criminal investigation against us. But simultaneously, the forum of our website was attacked by trolls. Firstly, we were shocked and surprised, because I don't know. It means that you're waiting for support from the public when you are acting in public interest. But very soon we noticed that there's hundreds of offensive commentaries that appeared on our forum, repeated the same things. I don't know, many times. Hundreds of times, and so we got the idea that they were trolls. They called us traitors. They said that we were paid agents of CIA and bad journalists who made reputation on people suffering and so on. But that was that time. Then, in the mid-2000s, many journalists in Russia who were critical of the Kremlin migrated to the social networks because they lost their jobs in the media because of the Kremlin censorship. And reporters turned to the bloggers, and they went to livejournal.com. This is a very popular blogging platform, whereas anonymous commenting is allowed. So it was the first target for the trolls attack. And then they migrated to Vkontakte, Russian social network, modeled after Facebook and very popular in Russia, and also Facebook and Twitter. And trolls followed them. The tactics was simple, and as another country also, It was to attack the liberal journalist and post a lot of offensive commentaries and also threats. To some extent, this tactic was successful, but not too much, because independent journalists understood very well the risk of being critical of the Kremlin and the Kremlin policy, and they weren't frightened very much. Trolls were relatively late on Facebook, because Facebook was not very popular in Russia and Kremlin did not understand the potential of Facebook. But when they appeared on Facebook, beyond offensive commentaries and threats, they adopted a new tactic. It was spamming a lot of spamming with complaints Facebook in order to block someone's account. For instance, 2 years ago, a Facebook account of prominent liberal Russian journalist Sergei Parkhomenko was blocked after he posted comment on investigation on the taking down of airplane MH17 in Ukraine, sensitive topic. And his account was blocked, and he believed that the online pro-Kremlin activists spammed Facebook with thousands of complaints. Fortunately, the Facebook solved the problem very fast, and his account was unblocked. But for people and for activists and journalists not so famous as this guy, it can take a lot of time to have their accounts unblocked.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and to also understand the evolution of the phenomena over there in Russia. Similarly, Emre from Turkey, since 2012, although I'm sure that there are instances even before that, but it seems how these attacks, how these campaigns have been, evolving and improving by the time.
Thank you, Javier. Although you already gave a good context to it, I will still make a context first, a bit broader context, before coming to Turkey in specific use. Now, the misuse, the social media environments, and how it creates a new atmosphere for communication between human beings, is the underlying problem behind all those troll attacks and other things online that we see every day. And it is the social media, on social media, how do we react? Normally, we have friends, and on social media, we have same people as friends, especially if you start a new Facebook account, the first people that you add are your relatives, father, mother, or children, or friends, real life friends. But on top of that, we are now in the past something called peer pressure, for instance, on traditional social relationships. There was something called peer pressure. Or while we were speaking to one of our friends or our mother face to face, we were actually, in our mental model, we were applying certain filters. Because when you are face to face with someone, your nature changes. The communication has a filter in your mind. Telephone first broke it in the early 20th century, but it was still a personal relation. Voice is also important. But on social media, usually no voice, no face-to-face seeing of each other. So we do not really apply those filters. So, for instance, I discovered that the husband of my aunt had really actually fascistic thoughts, and he was displaying it online so comfortably. He will never speak to me like that. He will never tell it on the phone about certain political parties. He had so strong views, for instance. I didn't know it before. So these strong views can be expressed online, and are increasingly expressed online, because other people see on online domain that this, you can say this, you can do this, it's normal. So the new normal on social media is actually polarizing the society, it's dividing the society, and that's why when we are looking at the problem of online trolls, we should categorize them. Some of these, what we call trolls, are like real people unaffiliated with anyone, and they are just really expressing their views, or these views can be hate speech, insults, slurs, etc., but they are sincere. These people are us, they are living among us. On the other side, the real problem that I am discussing now when calling online trolls is the organized troll armies. If you search my name plus trolls on Google, you can see some articles that I wrote, a video in English, a speech in English. You can see in detail there, because as Javier said, since 2012 I've been doing some research because it happened to me first. I mean, I was not the first person targeted in Turkey, obviously, but when it happened to me, I decided to search. And after this research, I saw that some massive, especially on Twitter, there were some massive armies of trolls controlled by people close to the ruling party, to the government, to the Turkish government. And it was, although the Twitter did not, at that time, it was too early actually, 2012 is, for Turkey, I mean, Twitter usage was not so widespread. It became really widespread with the Gezi Park protests, the massive anti-government protests in 2013. Twitter did not share its API with us. If we had the API, it could be really easy to find these relations, because when you see like 100 people mentioning my name after I wrote a critical article about Turkish government's foreign policy on Lebanon, so very specific subject, but suddenly people on Twitter having profile photos, no profile photos like X, Twitter just last week they changed the X, but in the past it was Twitter X, or some fake photos. Some of them are like famous people. Like for instance, once I saw Laura Bush insulting at me, or Jennifer Lopez, or people like that in Turkish. They of course, when you look to their real usernames, you see that these are not verified accounts, etc. It's easy to see, but still they were actually harnessing, they were cropping the photos elsewhere and making these automatically. Like they can, by clicking a button, they can make 100 or 1,000 fake Twitter profiles. Then they say that mention this person and use this message, so the same message, insults, etc. are coming. And these insults, I'm personally very tolerant about. I'm not thin-skinned at all. I mean, even if somebody cursing at me with swear words, etc., it's okay. But for me, I mean, some people call it like an attack on their honor, and libel laws, defamation. Just before that session, we had a session on legal aspects, both in Italy and in Turkey, and both in Italy and Turkey, Germany, and many places, defamation laws give the person the right to sue these people, even if it is not a death threat, for instance. But for me personally, I do not sue anyone as long as it is not a call to violence, death threats, or as we see in the instance of many female journalists in Turkey, the threat of rapes, etc. And we see after 2012, and I'm not going into the details of the evolution of the Turkish pro-government Twitter botnets. By the way, botnets are these completely fake automated accounts, plus that there are accounts that are like trying to becoming like big accounts with real people behind. These are still pro-government, but having real users, having real followers. So these are two different things. Before 2013, the government was, actually Turkish government did not really understand the importance of Twitter in shaping the public opinion. But with 2013 Gezi Park protests, as millions of Turks started to use Twitter actively, very actively, the government also changed its strategy and tried to find different methods to control Twitter as well. And after that, they couldn't control, so they banned it completely. For a long time, Twitter was banned in Turkey. And then Twitter complied with the government's requests, just like actually Facebook does. Facebook, from the start, is really friendly relations with the government in Turkey. Twitter was not like that until it was banned by Turkish government. And since then, now they have a better relationship, I can say, because, for instance, the Turkish government now can easily have access to a Twitter official in order to convey an administrative ruling, an administrative decree that calls for the blocking of a certain Twitter profile in Turkey. So a lot of profiles in Turkey, Twitter profiles in Turkey, are now blocked in Turkey. When I go to Turkey, I cannot see them. When I'm here, I can see them. A lot of hundreds of accounts like that. So they tried as the government. They couldn't. They were not successful at first. So they changed tactics. They used their youth organizations to do this, like, manually. Then they hired a lot of PR firms, possibly spending millions of dollars. Or perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then now I think they are happy with the current environment, because it was just one of the tools of controlling public discourse plus suppressing dissent, but it was an effective tool, online trolls. But there are other tools like jailing journalists, which is obviously more effective. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Emre, for the context to the context. It was actually very, very important. You actually raised two topics that we're going to talk in depth a little bit later. One is the fact about the female journalists and how viciously they are attacked and how they are targeted not only for being journalists but also for being women. And basically the viciousness, the imagery, the vivid threats that they receive, that they have to deal with on a daily basis. In some countries, it's really harmful. But also, you raised the part of the organized attacks and how this panel session is specifically about concerted attacks. In this case, after the context and the evolution of the online trolls in Russia and Turkey, what Austria has learned so far.
So I must say that it's really hard to compare the situation in Austria in any way to Turkey or Russia, because in Austria journalists do not get jailed because they are critical of their government, or we do not have government officials who are really blocking journalists' account. But we do have, let's say, a growing hostile environment towards journalists. And in our case, a lot of this aggression, it does not come from any party, it comes from a very specific direction. So to give you a better understanding, in Austria we have a quite strong right-wing populist party, the so-called Freedom Party, FPÖ, and they are at the moment in the polls at 30%. This is quite significant. There's a possibility that they would be the most successful party at the next election. And even if they're not the most successful party, they will have a dominant role. They have been really strong for years now. So the interesting thing is, bear in mind, 30% of the polls say that 30% of the voters might vote for them. And then you look at Facebook, and when you look at Facebook, you might get the impression that the majority of the Austrian people will vote for them. In the German-speaking countries, there is this word, the silent majority. Many right-wing users would say we are the silent majority and would be very actively and often aggressively talking about how they are being oppressed. And I think it is really important to explain that these sentiments, they do not come out of a vacuum, they are built or they are nurtured by certain hyper-partisan sites and also by very outspoken players online. And if you look at Austria first, I will get a bit into detail about Germany as well, but if you look at Austria, we see that you see it already, that Facebook, which is the most important social media by far in Austria, is really dominated by the right-wing populists. This is a ranking of the most successful Facebook accounts in Austria, and just you have to look at it. 5 of the top 10 accounts come from this party, and just to give you a better understanding, we have 6 parliamentary parties, and that one makes up like the half of the top 10. This is important. Then the number one account here, it's Heinz Christian Strache. He's the party leader, and he has more than 500,000 Facebook fans. And so you know, we are only 8 million people in Austria. This is like a really big number. So, and if you even put it into a bigger connection, in a bigger landscape, if you take all of the German-speaking countries, this right-wing populist is the second most successful politician on Facebook in all of the German-speaking countries, Austria, Switzerland, Germany. Only Angela Merkel is even more, let's say, popular on Facebook. But what does this mean? This means when you get targeted as a journalist by this political account, you will notice it, I promise you. So if he takes your name and your picture and writes something about it, you will get a lot of email, and other posts. And I have one example. We had recently a quite horrible election campaign time. During this time, there were 2 candidates in the final stages you could vote for, the right-wing candidate and the former leader of the Green Party. And it was very close that the right-wing candidate would have even become our president, which did not happen at the end. But during the stages before the final election, there was such a polarized debate and such a polarized online discussion especially, that it was also a very toxic environment for journalists. And the Freedom Party is well known since many, many years to be very critical and sometimes outright hostile towards journalists who are critical about them and who are asking tough questions. So in this case, you have to think what they did not just criticize journalists after they wrote a piece or after they would make an interview. Even before the interview, they would post about it. And I cannot explain and translate everything because this post is so full of insults that it would take too long. I'm sorry, it would really take too long, but I just give you an overview. This is the post, which kind of tells the Facebook users that they should watch television this evening because there will be an interview with the candidate of this party. And even so, they are saying just at the beginning that this TV station which made the interview, that they are having a hate campaign against their candidate, which was, they said, already happening yesterday. It was confrontation of 2 candidates. So they said it was a hate campaign. That was the beginning. Then it was like, he says, it would surprise anybody if it would be kind of fair. That's like the meaning of the first sentences. Then there are some insults against the journalist, blah, 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 blah. Yes, then there comes the word Systemmedienmanipulation here. Systemmedienmanipulation, it means manipulation by system media. And I'm pointing this out because Systempresse is a Nazi term. This was the term, one of the important terms of the NS ideologists to discredit journalists. And we have a lot of this language rising up again on the internet, which is really harsh language. This party sometimes in their Facebook posts, they also use the word Lügenpresse, another term often used by the Nazis to discredit journalists, and we have like this rebirth of very problematic language. So this is Systemmedienmanipulation. Then it's called, then he says that other journalists, he names a few other well-known journalists and calls them ideologische Freunde, which means ideological friends. So basically he says the journalists who are often asking tough questions, they are not fair, they are ideological. So he's framing the whole situation differently, and it's funny because, you know, he uses this post to also discredit other journalists as well. Then I cannot explain everything, also I ran out of space there, but then it says the last interview of this journalist is a female TV anchor woman. It broke all records in being low. Another thing they said. And then this is my favorite part. At the end, and there is the sentence, die ideologische Verzweiflung ist der jungen Dame ins Gesicht geschrieben. It means the ideological desolation is, it means you can see the ideological desperation of this young woman in her face. And what he does is he puts the young woman in, what's it called? Brackets, yeah. So it's a sexist remark as well, because it means she isn't young anymore. She's like 40 years old, I would guess. So this is even, like, let's say they even managed to get sexism in it as well. And so I just mentioned a few things that are in there. I'm sorry that it's really, really hard to explain such cultural, like, insults are often not that easy to understand. But after that, just to give you an impression, after that, of course, this journalist got amazing feedback, and she got many, many, many aggressive and somewhat unpleasant messages, email, posts on Facebook, comments on Facebook, messages on Facebook. And of course, she often got these, I don't call them rape threats, I call them rape fantasy. Like, she's really used in getting things like, you should be raped by 10 Afghans, or you should not be surprised if one day you also will get raped, things like that. So if you are in the business of writing about this party, you will, from users, often get this. And then I will show you something else. This is the ecosystem they've built on Facebook, but I'll just show it quickly to you that you see they have built up something big. And I will point this out, perhaps you see it, between the three top, on the right side, the three accounts, you see unzensuriert.at. This slide basically shows you the fans which are active on the Facebook account of the party leader, on which other accounts they are active. And they are also very active on a site which is called unzensuriert.at. It means uncensored.at. And this is a highly hyper-partisan site. Here you see a screenshot. What they are covering is, of course, the typical stuff such right-wing hyper-partisan sites cover. So it's a lot against Muslims, a lot against migrants, against feminists, against left-wing players, and against the media. And the thing is, if you write about this party in any way that the party doesn't like, there's a good chance that simultaneously you will get an article there. The thing is, these sites sometimes have an interesting close relationship with the party itself. In that case, the manager of the site, the financial manager of the site, actually works for the parliamentary group of the party. And the long-term editor-in-chief of the site, he is the leader of the communication bureau of the party. At the moment, they do not tell you who is the editor-in-chief of the site. Also, they do not tell any other names who is working for that site. So we cannot say, of all the people who write for this site, how many of them are actually working for the party. We can only say there are close ties. And for anything else, there is a good chance that you might get sued. So this is a bit complicated. Could you? Just one more. And just to finish it up, there are two things I want to tell you. A colleague and I, we looked at 2 weeks of this website and we analyzed every article. It was 224 articles, and we analyzed who got mentioned in a good way and who got mentioned in a rather not positive way. And then, because we were interested who are the biggest heroes for them and who are the players which they are writing the harshest about. And what we were really surprised about, the colleague and I, was that, of course, migrants were number one, so we had expected that. But I was really surprised that media organizations were number two. Of course, this is not a scientific study. It was only 2 weeks, 124 articles, but still you see how important covering traditional media organization is to them. And I myself, of course, have gotten articles there. It's very unpleasant, because when you get an article, the next thing what happens is the article is often, let's say, I wouldn't say fair, but they show your picture, they write critical stuff about you. You don't see who wrote the article, so you don't even know, hey, is this guy an employee of the party or somebody else? You don't see that. I don't have any proof who wrote the article. But if you then have the article, that's just the starting point. Because below the article, that's where it gets interesting, really interesting in my point of view, because there come the rather hard comments, there comes the really, really tough messages, and this is the last slide I'm going to show you. This is just 3 comments from this side about journalists, female journalists. Those comments sound a bit weird because these angry users, they often post in a weird way. So this, let me point this out on the right side. This is a really weird comment which says that you should use the picture of one of the journalists for target practice, and it's very specific. So it is in a legal sense, it's unclear if it's already a threat or just an insult, but this is not allowed in Austria to write such things. This is clear. Then the other thing is, it was the same journalist down there left. It says, pity that the gas chambers do not exist anymore. In Austria, we have quite strict laws against NS, ideologist wishes. We have strict laws against wishing for the Holocaust again, so this is also not allowed. And then there's another example. It says that they should, tear the womb out of a TV journalist and give it to a refugee seeker so he can use it on his way to the Sahara. It's also a very, I would say, unpleasant comment. And the interesting thing about these things, these comments stay there. The website does not actively moderate. With these 2 comments, for example, it was a colleague of mine at the magazine I used to work at. We sent them a letter of our attorney, and then it was taken down. And we are in a legal fight against this, over this issue. So what I do think is that it's important that media organizations use the current laws to protect the journalists of such vague threats or very clear threats. And just one last thing, perhaps also as a debate, I mentioned to you that the right-wing sphere is really strong in Austria and that we have sites like these. The interesting thing is just last week, this site, unzensuriert.at, it started a spin-off in Germany. So it was even quicker than Breitbart was with going to Germany, since they are quite successful in Austria, and already now some of the readers are from Germany. Apparently they are trying to also become a brand for the right-wing scene in Germany. And I think they might be successful, but only if the Alternative für Deutschland, the so-called Alternative for Germany, AfD, will also boost their articles. Because this site, it's successful because the leader of the right-wing party often shares it on Facebook. And I'm very curious to see if in Germany this site will also be able to establish a presence there and become a well-known brand among voters of a right-wing party. So yeah, that's my overview.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to see how three different countries with three different political backgrounds, from a communist part, like country mainly communist, to conservative Islamic and Muslim country, to all the way to Austria, to Europe. They share certain common techniques and strategies. Irina, can you actually walk us through a campaign, an online campaign to targeting a journalist in Russia? How it develops, basically?
You mean how trolls are organized?
Yeah, exactly.
Trolls are not the part of the government. There is some independent organizations that was hired by the Kremlin's people and directed by the Kremlin's people and also paid by the Kremlin's people. So there is one brilliant example of how they are operating. This is a trolls factory in St. Petersburg that was exposed by many Russian and also Western media, say more than a year ago. It was set up as an independent company, commercial company called something like Internet Research Agency, and they rented a building quite big, and they hired dozens of people. And these people were given instructions on a daily basis, and their work was to post and still to post something offensive to certain politicians and like Obama, or say a representative of Russian opposition, or anybody who was targeted by the Kremlin. And they also was often tasked to post some fake news about some proper person in order to, and after that, this smear news was picked up by pro-Kremlin TV channels or pro-Kremlin online media. All these people were paid, so they got official salary, paid taxes, and so on. So that scheme was organized in this particular case, but there is also a lot of small trolls factories across the country, in many regions, paid by governors or city or mayor's office, but they are all some kind of informal actors, just informal actors or activists hired by the Kremlin.
In Turkey, basically, there's several of examples on how not only using social media platforms, such Twitter in the case mainly of Turkey, how they, besides that, there are also these parallel attacks as well around the same time. Like we were talking about, also there are like several examples, such uncensuriert.at, like we can talk about Kamal and Kebab and Fact Check in Turkey.
The important thing is that I think these attacks will continue, whatever you do. These online trolls will continue to be with us, as I say, because the underlying problem is the social media, the digital landscape, this domain, and the relationship between people, and how it has changed compared to traditional relationships. So they will continue to do so. So just figuring out how they operate is really important. As I say, the details can be found in my articles. It's so long, so I won't even summarize here. We are running out of time. That's why I just want to say something about the solution, what can be done against such attacks. I believe that the first thing to do is that, I'm a fan of Marcus Aurelius. I read the Meditations. There, one of the principles, the life principles that he says, like all Stoics, is that people can do something to you. You cannot prevent them from doing. You may not be able to do so, But how you react is your choice. It's always your choice. If they insult you, if they defame you on social media, will you be intimidated? Will you feel sad? Will you feel, stressed? And these will change your actions or will not? So it shouldn't. If you are really loyal to your own soul, you should not be affected by such attacks. These are just nothing, they can do. Of course, the other step is that death threats, etc. And these should not be overlooked. You shouldn't ignore. If there is threat of violence, you should definitely go to police, go to the courts, report it, publicize it online that you are receiving death targets. While ignoring all the other things, this should be taken seriously, definitely. And the next step, especially for oppressive governments, authoritarian governments, that they may jail you. Of course, or they can kill you. This is the worst thing. But for International Press Institute's Turkish National Committee Chairman Kadri Gürsel, who we are working with, has been in jail since October 31st, for instance, for just writing his opinions, for voicing his critical opinions. He's a world-class journalist. He is like completely stick to the universal principles of journalism. Was kidnapped by terror organizations, and while reporting, worked at Agence France Presse, other important news organizations. So very prestigious journalist. Is in jail now, and just last week he sent a note from the jail. By the way, he is also in isolation. We cannot see him. I cannot go to visit him. We sent letters. They don't give the letters to him. He cannot send letters to us. He can only see the lawyer in a very limited condition, and his wife only for 1 hour in the presence of prison guards and cameras and voice recorders. So very inhumane conditions. But still, last week with the lawyer, he sent a note out of the prison, and he said that I will not give them the feeling of enjoy by thinking that I am being tortured in prison psychologically, oppressed, etc. No, I am like I was. So it didn't change, even the prison. So these online trolls, etc., these armies and attacks should be confronted like such dignity and such bravery. And another thing very important for the solution is that in order to break up these assailing networks, what we do, as Ingrid also did, by analyzing social media context and trying to make sense of these groups and where they belong, is it organized, etc. These are like really time consuming if Facebook, Twitter and other social networks do not help people. So this is the social media companies' responsibility. These are their users, and when I, for instance, receive a death threat on Twitter, I want Twitter not just to delete that profile or that tweet, but also instantly give me all the networks that he belongs, because they have this data, and if they can at least share their API, we can see it quickly, so that we can understand who is behind, because I'm not interested in this bot. This is usually not even a human.
Mm-hmm. We're running out of time. We are open the floor for questions. Hold on, there's a microphone coming.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for sharing your stories and your research. I'm really interested in that. I'm Michelle Ferrier from Ohio University, and I'm also the founder of Trollbusters, that supports women journalists with just-in-time education as well as protection at the point of attack. And so we had very little time for solutions, but I wanted to let people know that we are actively working not only to educate journalists so that they can be preventive in protecting themselves when these things happen. I'm not going to say if these things happen. I think this panel has demonstrated very clearly when this happens, how to protect yourselves. And that also, if you have an opportunity, we have an additional panel. We've had 3 today on online harassment, and I think all of them have been fascinating. We have a panel at 5 o'clock where I will have available an infographic that we've created that talks about different kinds of threats. One of the biggest issues that we've heard here is not only the governmental threats, but also our own professional culture that prevents us from coming forward and talking about these issues and describing them. We can't even talk about this in our own newspapers because of the language that's used. And so I think the more that we have these types of forums and panels, I think is critical. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm taking several questions at the same time, just in case anyone wants to raise their hands. No? All clear? Okay, very good. So, yeah, please, just to close the panel. Please.
I want to say something to Emre, because I think you made a really passionate point about showing that you get not broken by this. But on the other hand, I'm afraid that a stoic approach to this, I also see a danger in that. Because I remember when I was called Lügenpresse for the first time, it really shocked me. Because you don't know the person knows nothing you have ever written, and there is this distrust and this saying that you lie. So I remember how shocked I was. And when I now get like tweets or things like that that call me Lügenpresse, I don't even barely notice it. And I think this should not be the new normal. I think that, of course, insults, we will not get rid of them. This is not going to happen. But with these real threats and also vague threats, I think there needs more to be done. For example, there was a Twitter account a few weeks back. It was kind of weird and cryptic, and at the end it said, "And you will die soon," to me. And I reported it to Twitter, and Twitter did not have any problems with that. And this is like happening often, as you know. So I think this cannot be the new normal. I think what we really do need, that's what would be one easy and manageable step, is to have platforms take responsibility to really respect the existing laws in countries. I think that in many countries the existing laws are not that bad, but they just don't get enforced. And I don't think that the new normal should be that we ignore our own laws and have such messages be considered not problematic.
Any closing remarks, Ingrid? Sorry, Irina?
I have some considerations about the way of thinking that Facebook and Twitter and other social networks have to block some trolls and offensive commenters, and I can explain why. Because you know that it's sometimes it's very difficult to draw a line between the trolls who are hired by somebody and paid by somebody or biased by some parties, and the real people who are angered by your reporting or your activity. So I don't know. There is this problem could not be solved with algorithms. That is in reality maybe a decision for Twitter and Facebook. And so, and as for me, it's the danger of some kind of censorship is too big. But I think that army of bots, robots, may be banned from the system, from the social network with algorithms. That problem could be solved, but that's all.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Ingrid Bratnik, Irina Borogan, and Emre Kiselkeya. It's very important to understand that this phenomena, it's not only about cases and personal experiences, which we haven't had time today to basically tackle. It's also very important to understand that all these sort of campaigns are being used and are being organized and concerted by people that we vote for, or by people who are also that can actually have the chance to govern and to rule certain countries. So yeah, it's important also to have all this in mind. Thank you very much for your attention, and also just before you go, we're going to do this little demonstration that it's actually very helpful for all the journalists in Turkey in prison. I was speaking with one of our colleagues last night, precisely, Gulsing Harman, and she was saying how important it is for the people in behind jailed, to learn to know that we are outside supporting them. So because even if it's difficult to reach them, it's also, well, somehow it does. So thank you very much. Just hold on for a second. We're going to hold the markers. Thank you very much. We had like cases where the attacks against a specific journalist were informed of DDoS attacks, basically trying to take down their blogs, trying to take down the websites where they were working from. Also news websites, or let's say masquerade as news websites supported by very dubious foundations, wrote smear articles against the journalists. Also at the same time, they were receiving phishing emails with very specific and tailored links where they can actually click, usually faking trusted sources. Also at the same time, there was these hacking attempts on social media accounts, people or hackers trying to gain access to Twitter. It's also important to understand, or at least in the area of Turkey, is that the social media platform that steers the political debate in Turkey, it's basically Twitter, that has a lot of impact in terms of the political debate. So a closer look into all these parallel attacks, what we discovered is that the sources were pretty similar, or they shared some of the sources, or they were retweeting, or then the core idea that all these different paths shared were exactly the same, and they were also sort of sharing the same objective, trying to discredit, trying to silence, to intimidate the journalists. So what we thought is that, well, that's pretty much all these 5 elements. It's what we thought that conformed an online campaign. Here we're not talking about like real physical attacks or legal prosecution. We're talking specifically about online campaigns. And what we saw as well at the same time is that in order to do all that, that requires a lot of resources, both economic resources. Well, first of all, thank you very much for all of you to come all the way to San Galo in almost siesta time. So thank you very much. Well, just we have on the screen the Free Turkey Journalist. This is a campaign that the IPI, the International Press Institute, it's together with other partners and journalists, in Turkey, we are developing right now because, I'm sure you probably know what's the situation in Turkey, but there are around 150 journalists imprisoned right now, and at the end of the panel, just for the last 3 minutes, we're going to do a small, holding the pancards and a demonstration. Just basically, if you want to participate, to show support for all the journalists imprisoned in Turkey. But the main topic of this panel is online harassment against journalists, and specifically the online harassment against journalists as a tool that states and powerful actors, state actors, such as political parties, are starting to use to discredit and to silence critical voices and dissent in the country. Basically, the idea is that IPI started to work on that, on online harassment back in 2014. One of our first ideas was to try to understand what the online harassment was specifically. And rather than coming up with a definition, what we decided is to work on the attacks itself, to try to understand the threats, the aggressions, and the patterns that they may take at that point. Basically, what we did, it's for resources and human resources. So by putting all these elements together, what we saw is that only states and powerful state actors, such political parties, were able to develop and implement something like that. So to talk precisely about all these from three very unique perspectives, we have three experts on the matter. Here with me we have Irina Borogan, who is a Russian investigative journalist, deputy editor and co-founder of Agentura.ru, and the co-author, together with Andrei Solotov, of the book, The Red Web, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. And basically is the struggle between Russia's digital dictators and the new online revolutionaries. Also Ingrid Bratnik, a border journalist from Austria, and the author of Hass im Netz, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but it's hate on the net, online violence, basically. She's also an expert on the matter and will actually bring to the discussion what's happening with the far-right movement in German-speaking countries and the digital ecosystem. And finally, with us, the digital media manager of Hurriyet, which is one of the biggest newspapers in Turkey, and also an expert on the matter since he's been writing about trolls in Turkey and online harassment since 2012, even before the Gezi Park protest started. So thank you very much for all of you to come here. And let's just jump in. Irina, we might start with you. Basically, the idea is, first of all, what we like to know is a little bit of the context. How in Russia, that seems to be one of the precursors of this online harassment and the troll factories, how all the situation evolved since 2006, 2007, 2002, where you have been actually working on it. 67% of all the sample that we collected are implied threats, or threats that you have to read in between lines. Most of the attacks were basically 760 were related to abusive behavior, and 14 attacks that we actually monitored and collected was technical interference. This is just a snapshot of the amount of attacks and instances of threats, and but of course we didn't pretend to collect everything because it was humanly impossible for us to do at that point. So basically, if you have time, you can go and explore basically different sort of data. You can cross data by abusive behavior, by gender, by background, etc. So what we achieved with that was to understand a little bit what was the attacks itself, the instances. But during that process, what we discovered is that there are certain patterns as well. Basically, 51% of the attacks have to do of violent threats, and death threats had to do with nationalism in Turkey. 31% had to do around politics and criticizing what AKP and the government was the policies that they were implementing, and 12% related to terrorism or accusing the journalists of being spies, terrorists themselves. But basically, what we discovered as well is that besides this online harassment and threats on social media platforms, basically we studied in Turkey Twitter, and in Austria Facebook. What we discovered is that there were also different parallel attacks happening at the same time or around the same time. This can be, or probably like a few months, we did a couple of missions to Turkey, but also in Austria and Hungary. And what we tried to decide is what was the impact on journalists, the psychological impact, the professional toll as well, that these sort of attacks had on the issue, on the journalists, on their work. Basically, the main idea is, after all that, and learning from basically the one-on-one interviews, we saw that there is basically sort of a standard sort of attacks. With all that, what we did, we came with a methodology, basically a list of categories with which we tried to, shed some light into the phenomena. for a year, from 2016, January 2016, all the way to January 2017. We collected threats, what we say instances of attacks, that's what we call it, and we analyze them according to around 20 different variables. We poured all the data, into an interactive database that you can see right here. It's online dv.ipi.media, and the three categories that we came up with, broad categories, was threats of violence, abusive behavior, and technical interferences. Eventually, in total, we've collected around a sample of 1,065 instances of online threats and verbal abuse. The collection of data was in 2 different countries, was Austria and Turkey. I'm going to show you Turkey. Basically, what you can see here is that, out of the threats of violence, most of them, or like a huge percentage, 118 instances, actually